The heavy oak door of the Murray apartment clicked open, the sound echoing through the shadowed hallway. Balthazar, sitting perfectly still in the unlit confines of his study, paused his breath. It was his wife, Bryony. But the low, breathless laughter accompanying her didn't belong to him. It belonged to Julian St. James. Right there, beneath the glow of an authentic 19th century chandelier, they discarded their coats and their vows. Balthazar didn't storm out. He didn't scream. As a forensic accountant, he knew that the most devastating ruin wasn't born of explosive anger, but of cold, meticulous calculation. He sat in the dark, watching his life shatter, already drafting the blueprint of their absolute destruction. If stories of dark secrets, silent revenge, and the devastating price of betrayal speak to your soul, stay with me. Let's walk through the shadows of Paris together. The silence of the apartment was a heavy, expensive thing. It was the kind of quiet that cost millions of euros, purchased in the heart of Le Marais, insulated against the bustling Parisian streets outside. Balthazar sat in the high-backed leather chair of his study, enveloped in shadows. The only light came from the faint, amber glow of the street lamps filtering through the tall French windows, casting elongated, skeletal shadows across the herringbone parquet floor. He had returned from Geneva a day early. A canceled meeting, an earlier flight. He had meant to surprise his wife, Bryony. Instead, the universe had delivered a surprise to him. The heavy oak front door groaned on its brass hinges, a sound Balthazar knew intimately. He almost stood up, almost called out her name. But the sound that followed froze the blood in his veins. "Hurry," a man's voice whispered, thick with urgency and amusement. "He has cameras in the lobby." "Not in the private elevator," Bryony's voice replied. Her tone was light, airy, and laced with a breathless anticipation that Balthazar hadn't heard directed at him in years. "And the staff thinks he's in Switzerland until tomorrow. We are perfectly safe, Julian." Balthazar's hand gripped the armrest of his chair. The leather creaked, a microscopic sound swallowed by the rustle of coats being discarded in the foyer. Julian St. James. The charismatic, silver-tongued art dealer whom Bryony had introduced to Balthazar 6 months ago at a gallery opening. The man who had sat at Balthazar's dining table, drinking his rare Bordeaux, laughing at his jokes. From the crack in the study door, Balthazar had a narrow, unobstructed view of the hallway leading to the master bedroom. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. They walked into his line of sight. Julian had his hands tangled in Bryony's dark hair, his mouth pressed against her neck. Bryony's eyes were closed, her head tilted back, her fingers unbuttoning Julian's silk shirt. They moved with the frantic, careless energy of people who believe themselves entirely invisible. They stumbled against the antique console table, rattling a priceless Ming vase. A primal, violent urge surged in Balthazar's chest. The instinct of a husband was to burst through the door, to shout, to tear the man away from his wife, to shatter the fragile, beautiful illusion of their life together into a million jagged pieces. His muscles coiled, ready to spring. But Balthazar was not just a husband. He was a forensic accountant. He spent his life dissecting ruins, tracking the invisible flow of hidden assets, dismantling lies built by desperate, greedy people. He knew that an explosion of anger was a sudden release of power, but it left a mess. It allowed the guilty to defend themselves, to lie, to manipulate the narrative. Silence, however, was a weapon. Information was an executioner's blade. He watched them disappear into the master bedroom. The door clicked shut. Soon, the muffled sounds of their intimacy began to bleed through the walls. Every gasp, every whispered word felt like a physical knife carving out his insides. His chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He stared at the empty hallway, his eyes fixing on the painting hanging above the console table they had just bumped into. A late 19th century impressionist landscape Bryony had curated for their private collection. In the dim light, the painting looked different. Stripped of its prestigious context, it just looked like strokes of oil on canvas. Illusions. Everything was an illusion. Balthazar slowly reached out and picked up his crystal tumbler of scotch from the desk. The ice had melted, watering down the amber liquid. He took a sip, the bitter taste grounding him. He would not confront her tonight. He would not give them the satisfaction of a screaming match of panicked apologies or defensive lies. If Bryony wanted to play a game of shadows in his house, she would soon learn that her husband was the master of the dark. Balthazar leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and unblinking, as he began to calculate the precise, mathematical cost of her betrayal. The sun rose over the zinc roofs of Paris, painting the Marais in soft, deceptive hues of rose and gold. Balthazar had not slept a single minute. At 4 a.m, long before the city stirred, he had silently slipped out of the apartment via the service stairs, carrying his luggage. He walked the chilling, empty streets for hours until the city awakened, only to return at 8 o'clock in a taxi, perfectly playing the part of the exhausted, returning traveler. When the heavy oak door clicked open this time, it was by his own hand. The scent of freshly ground espresso drifted down the hallway, mingling with the expensive floral notes of lilies arranged on the console table. Bryony was in the kitchen, standing by the marble island in a pristine white silk robe. The morning light caught the elegant curve of her neck, the same neck Balthazar had watched Julian kiss hours prior. When she heard his footsteps, she turned, her face lighting up with a flawless, radiant smile. "Balthazar, darling," she breathed, walking toward him with graceful, measured steps. "You're early. I thought your flight wasn't until noon." She wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her lips to his cheek. It took every ounce of Balthazar's willpower not to flinch. Beneath her signature Chanel perfume, his heightened senses detected the faint, lingering trace of bergamot and cedar, Julian's cologne. "The Swiss delegates settled early," Balthazar replied, his voice a masterclass in steady, affectionate exhaustion. He placed a hand on her waist, applying just the right amount of pressure to mimic his usual morning greeting. "I wanted to come home to you." "I am so glad you did," she murmured, pouring him a cup of dark espresso. Her eyes, a striking shade of hazel, held nothing but innocent devotion. It was terrifying, Balthazar realized, how beautifully she could curate a lie. She was treating their marriage just like her museum exhibits, perfectly lit, carefully arranged, and entirely fabricated for the audience. 30 minutes later, Bryony left for the gallery, leaving Balthazar alone in the cavernous apartment. He did not unpack his suitcase. Instead, he walked straight into his study, locked the heavy doors, and booted up his encrypted workstation. The time for grief had passed in the dark hours of the night. Now, it was time for an audit. To Balthazar, a marriage was a complex partnership, a merger of assets, time, and trust. Bryony had breached the contract. He bypassed the standard security protocols on their shared home network with the ease of a man who hunted offshore shell companies for a living. He mirrored her laptop's hard drive and intercepted the backup of her phone data from the cloud server. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, his face illuminated by the harsh, blue light of 3 monitors. He began cross-referencing her digital footprints. She was smart enough to use encrypted messaging apps, but she was entirely careless with her metadata. Balthazar pulled her banking statements, cab receipts, and calendar appointments. He ran a proprietary algorithm he used to trace corporate embezzlement, setting the parameters to search for overlapping anomalies between her schedule and Julian St. James's known gallery events. The results populated the screen in a cascading waterfall of damning data. The private viewings marked in her calendar. The seemingly innocuous charges at boutique hotels in the 8th arrondissement. The excessive Uber rides to addresses that match properties owned by Julian's holding company. It was not a momentary lapse of judgment. It was not a drunken mistake. Balthazar stared at the timeline materializing on his left monitor. The data stretched back 14 months. For over a year, she had been meticulously stealing time, affection, and dignity from their marriage, funneling it all into a shadow ledger with another man. The numbers did not lie. They held no emotion, no regret, and no mercy. As Balthazar saved the compiled dossier onto a secure, encrypted drive, the final shreds of his broken heart calcified into something hard, sharp, and terribly dangerous. The glowing monitors in Balthazar's study had become his only remaining tether to reality. Having mapped the agonizing geography of his wife's infidelity, his forensic instincts, honed by years of hunting phantom assets and white-collar criminals, demanded he follow the money. In Balthazar's extensive professional experience, men like Julian St. James did not merely steal wives out of uncontrollable passion. They were parasites drawn to proximity, power, and capital. Balthazar shifted his focus from Bryony's personal metadata to Julian's business filings. He bypassed the public registry of Julian's boutique gallery and dug straight into the corporate shell structures beneath it. For 3 hours, the only sound in the apartment was the rhythmic, relentless clatter of mechanical keys. He traced wire transfers through a labyrinth of dummy corporations in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. Julian was moving money, carefully layering it to avoid the detection of European tax authorities. But Balthazar was a predator in this digital ecosystem. He found the thread and pulled. The financial anomalies all converged on a single, massive transaction dated 3 months prior. It was tied to the Metropolitan Gallery, where Bryony served as senior curator. Balthazar pulled up the museum's public press releases. 3 months ago, Bryony had proudly unveiled a rediscovered masterpiece by a late 19th century post-impressionist, acquired from an anonymous private collector. It was the crowning achievement of her recent career. Balthazar cross-referenced the museum's acquisition ledger with Julian's hidden offshore accounts. The numbers aligned with terrifying precision. He calculated the diverted funds on a secured digital notepad, $text unaccounted capital equals $12,500,000, text gallery commission plus text taxes equals $8,250,000 exactly $8,250,000 had been quietly funneled into a blind trust controlled by Julian. Julian was the anonymous seller, but the scheme ran deeper than a simple conflict of interest. Balthazar accessed the museum's digital archives, pulling up the ultra-high-resolution multispectral scans of the newly acquired painting. As a seasoned art collector himself, Balthazar knew how to look at a canvas. He zoomed in on the macro photography of the brushstrokes, studying the crack allure, the fine pattern of cracking on the surface of the dried oil paint. He ran the image through an analysis software designed to detect inconsistencies in antique materials. The results highlighted microscopic anomalies in the pigment layering. The titanium white used in the highlight of the sky contained an isotopic signature that did not exist before the 1940s. The painting was a forgery. The revelation hit Balthazar with the physical force of a blow to the chest. He sat back in the leather chair, staring at the screen. Bryony, an expert with a flawless reputation, had not made a mistake. She had intentionally authenticated a brilliant fake sold by her lover, using the museum's endowment to enrich them both. Her betrayal was not a desperate search for romance in a fading marriage. It was a highly calculated, lucrative criminal syndicate. She had weaponized their shared passion for fine art, turning the very foundation of their high society life into a front for grand larceny. The woman he loved was completely gone, replaced by a stranger who possessed the cold, mechanical greed of a con artist. Balthazar closed his eyes, the blue light of the monitors washing over his pale face. The pain in his chest slowly receded, leaving behind an absolute, freezing void. If Bryony and Julian were playing a game of high-stakes fraud, Balthazar would not simply divorce her. He would dismantle their empire, brick by stolen brick. The digital trail of the forged canvas did not end at Julian's offshore bank accounts. It bled into the physical world through the procurement of highly specific, rare materials. Balthazar spent the following 48 hours tracking the supply chain of vintage pigments. He isolated a recurring purchase of aged canvases and a specific formulation of titanium dioxide, $text, $2 from a niche chemical supplier in Germany, shipped directly to an industrial address in Montreuil, on the gritty eastern outskirts of Paris. The name attached to the lease was Rowena. No surname, just a ghost operating in the periphery of the Parisian art scene. Balthazar left his pristine Marais apartment under the gray, bruised sky of late afternoon. He drove his sleek black sedan away from the manicured boulevards and into the labyrinth of decaying warehouses and graffiti-scarred concrete. He parked outside a defunct textile factory, the air thick with the acrid scent of damp brick and motor oil. He climbed 3 flights of rusted iron stairs and knocked on a heavy steel door. There was a long pause, followed by the grinding of multiple deadbolts. The door opened a fraction. A woman in her late 30s, with sharp, hollowed features and hands stained with linseed oil and burnt umber, peered out. Rowena looked exactly like a woman who painted masterpieces in the dark, exhausted, brilliant, and deeply paranoid. "I am not buying, and I am not taking commissions," she stated, her voice raspy, laced with the grit of cheap tobacco. She moved to shut the door. Balthazar placed a polished, Italian leather shoe against the doorframe. He did not push. He simply made it an immovable object. "I am not here for a commission, Rowena," Balthazar said, his tone as smooth and cold as polished marble. "I am here about the post-impressionist landscape you sold to Julian St. James, the one sitting in the Metropolitan Gallery." Rowena's eyes darted down the empty corridor, the color draining from her face. "I don't know what you are talking about." "I am a forensic accountant," Balthazar continued, his voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "I know about the offshore accounts in Cyprus. I know Julian paid you a fraction of the $8 million he made from my wife's authentication. What you don't know is that Julian is building a paper trail that will ultimately leave you and me to take the fall when the authorities notice the discrepancies." He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the invisible noose to settle around her neck. He wasn't a jealous husband screaming about his ruined marriage. He was a calculator, presenting an unsolvable equation of her impending ruin. Rowena slowly opened the door, stepping back to let him into a studio choked with the fumes of turpentine and drying varnish. Half-finished canvases leaned against the exposed brick walls like ghosts of dead masters. "Julian promised the trail was insulated," she muttered, pacing across the paint-splattered floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling slightly. "He said the curator was entirely under his control." "My wife is under his control," Balthazar corrected, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But the money is not. Julian is severing ties. He is preparing to vanish, and he will leave you holding the brush when the Interpol raid happens." Rowena stopped pacing. She looked at Balthazar, truly seeing the devastating stillness of a man who had nothing left to lose. She walked over to a battered metal workbench, pulled open a rusted drawer, and retrieved a heavy, brass key with a geometric magnetic fob attached to it. "Julian doesn't just sell fakes," Rowena whispered, holding the key out to him. The metal gleamed dully under the harsh fluorescent lights. "He swaps them. The real masterpieces, the ones Bryony replaces with my work, they don't go to the black market immediately. He hoards them." Balthazar looked at the key, recognizing the emblem of a high-security, climate-controlled storage facility located near the Charles de Gaulle airport. "Take it," she said, her voice hollow. "Burn him to the ground before he burns us." Balthazar closed his fingers around the cold brass. It was not just a key to a vault. It was the weapon that would sever the veins of his wife's criminal empire. Returning to the sterile, high-end apartment in Le Marais felt like walking onto a theater stage where the play had ended, but the actors had yet to realize it. Balthazar set the brass key on his mahogany desk. It felt heavier than it looked, weighted with the stolen masterpieces of Paris. He sat before his monitors, the screens glowing like 3 blue eyes in the dark study. Armed with the physical location of the vault near Charles de Gaulle, he traced the digital payment history for the storage unit's monthly lease. It led back to a complex web of shell companies Julian had established. But Balthazar was not merely looking for rent receipts anymore. He was looking for the exit strategy. Julian was a grifter. Grifters always built a backdoor before they set the house on fire. Balthazar employed a sophisticated piece of intrusion software, a digital skeleton key used by forensic auditors to pry open heavily encrypted corporate ledgers. He slipped past Julian's rudimentary firewalls and entered a hidden directory labeled Archival Acquisitions. What he found was a masterclass in financial framing. Julian had not simply laundered the money from the fake paintings. He had meticulously fabricated a secondary, invisible ledger that connected the fraudulent sales directly to Balthazar's own consulting firm. There were forged emails, backdated invoices, and a web of dummy accounts established using Balthazar's stolen social insurance numbers and forged signatures. Balthazar scrolled through the fabricated documents, his jaw tightening into a rigid line. He read an email chain drafted between Julian and a Swiss buyer, heavily implying that Balthazar was the silent architect of the entire forgery ring, using his wife's museum position as a convenient front. The strategy was brutally effective. If the French authorities or Interpol ever discovered the fakes, like the $8.25 million post-impressionist landscape, the paper trail would lead investigators past Julian, right to Balthazar's doorstep. Julian would vanish with millions, and Balthazar would face decades in a high-security prison for grand larceny, fraud, and the destruction of cultural heritage. But what froze Balthazar's blood was not Julian's cunning. It was the digital footprint on the forged documents. He pulled up the metadata of the fabricated invoices that implicated him. He ran the author tags through a diagnostic check. The creator of the documents was not Julian. The IP address originated from their very own apartment in Le Marais. The user profile was heavily encrypted, but the keystroke patterns and the timestamp aligned perfectly with Bryony's hours spent working from home. Bryony was not a naive victim caught in Julian's charismatic snare. She was the active architect of her husband's destruction. She had spent the last year lying in his bed, kissing his cheek in the morning, while methodically drafting the paperwork to send him to a concrete cell. Balthazar leaned back, the blue light reflecting in eyes that had gone entirely dead. The final, microscopic sliver of hope that she had been manipulated was extinguished. His wife was a monster wrapped in silk and Chanel. He did not smash the keyboard. He did not cry out. He reached for his scotch, pouring a measure of pure, amber liquid over a single block of ice. He raised the glass to the glowing screens, a silent, solitary toast to the death of his marriage and the birth of a predator. They wanted to frame him. They wanted to use his life as a shield for their escape. Balthazar opened a command terminal and began to type, his fingers moving with absolute, terrifying precision. He wasn't going to just delete the forged files. He was going to use them to tie the noose tightly around Julian and Bryony's necks. He would rewrite the code of their destruction, turning their own perfect frame job into an inescapable digital guillotine. The game was no longer about a broken heart. It was a war of annihilation. The dining room of the Marais apartment was a masterpiece of orchestrated elegance. Crystal wine glasses caught the light of the baccarat chandelier, reflecting fractured prisms across the polished mahogany table. Bryony had arranged a centerpiece of white orchids, delicate and devoid of scent, perfect for a woman whose life was built on beautiful, hollow aesthetics. Balthazar stood by the vintage credenza, carefully decanting a 1996 Chateau Margaux. He wore a bespoke navy suit, the very picture of a successful, oblivious husband. At 8 o'clock sharp, the heavy oak door chimed, and Julian St. James stepped into the foyer. "Julian, so glad you could make it," Bryony cooed, her voice pitched in that breathless register Balthazar had heard from the shadows of his study. She kissed him on both cheeks, a standard Parisian greeting that, to Balthazar's trained eye, lingered a fraction of a second too long. Julian handed Balthazar his coat, offering a charming, predatory smile. "Balthazar, thank you for having me. The museum's latest acquisition gala has kept Bryony far too busy lately. We barely have time for a civilized dinner." "Yes, the post-impressionist landscape," Balthazar replied smoothly, pouring the deep ruby wine into 3 glasses. He handed one to Julian, their fingers brushing against the cool crystal. "A remarkable find, Julian. Bryony tells me it's the crown jewel of the season." "It has its charms," Julian said modestly, swirling the wine and holding it to the light. "But the true art is in the curation. Bryony's eye is flawless. They moved to the dining table, the air thick with an unspoken electric tension. Balthazar took his seat at the head of the table, flanked by the two people actively drafting his ruin. He cut into his rare duck breast, the knife scraping softly against the fine porcelain. I was reading an interesting article today, Balthazar began casually, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin, about the recent surge in high-level art forgery. It seems the syndicates are getting incredibly sophisticated. They aren't just faking the canvas, they are faking the provenance, fabricating entire histories. Bryony's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Her hazel eyes darted to Julian, a microscopic flicker of panic betraying her composed facade. Really? Julian asked, his charming smile tightening infinitesimally at the corners. I hadn't heard. The market is always full of rumors, Balthazar, mostly peddled by jealous dealers who missed out on a genuine piece. Perhaps, Balthazar conceded, taking a slow sip of the Margot. But the forensic analysis is fascinating. They use advanced multispectral imaging. It can detect isotopic anomalies in pigments like titanium white. Even the most brilliant forgery crumbles under a microscope. The silence that followed was heavy, stifling. The only sound was the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Balthazar watched the color drain from his wife's face, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her wine glass. It sounds terribly invasive, Bryony finally managed to say, her voice tight. To dissect a beautiful thing until it loses its soul. On the contrary, my dear, Balthazar smiled, his eyes locking onto hers with a cold, terrifying intensity. It's about finding the truth hidden beneath the layers of paint. A forgery, no matter how beautiful, is still a lie. And lies always leave a trace. Don't you agree, Julian? Julian cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. Indeed. But a true expert knows what they are looking at. Exactly, Balthazar agreed, shifting his gaze back to his plate. Which is why I find it so reassuring that you handled the acquisition, Bryony. I know you would never let a fake slip through your fingers. He let the comment hang in the air, a perfectly weighted anchor dragging them both into the dark depths of paranoia. Balthazar had not accused them of anything, but he had systematically dismantled their sense of security. He watched them exchange a panicked, silent conversation across the table, the seeds of doubt taking root in the fertile soil of their guilt. The dinner proceeded, but the taste of the expensive wine had turned to ash in their mouths. Balthazar remained a gracious host, pouring more wine, asking polite questions about Julian's upcoming exhibitions. He was a spider sitting patiently in the center of a very expensive, highly curated web, watching the flies begin to thrash against the silk. The invitation to the Biennale in Venice arrived on heavy, embossed cardstock. It was the perfect alibi. Bryony and Julian would be surrounded by the international art elite for 48 hours, drinking Bellinis and discussing acquisitions, completely insulated from the silent war Balthazar was waging in Paris. Balthazar watched from the bedroom window as Bryony's town car pulled away from the curb in Le Marais, her Louis Vuitton luggage loaded into the trunk by a driver who was undoubtedly on Julian's payroll. He waited precisely 1 hour, tracking her phone's GPS until it pinged at Charles de Gaulle, confirming she was boarding the private jet. Then, Balthazar moved. He dressed in unassuming, dark clothing, a stark contrast to his usual tailored suits. In his jacket pocket rested the heavy brass key and the magnetic fob Rowena had given him. He bypassed his own vehicle, opting instead for a rented, nondescript sedan paid for in cash under an assumed name. The drive to the industrial sector near the airport took 40 minutes through the gray, relentless Parisian drizzle. The storage facility was a fortress of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete, entirely devoid of signage. It was designed to look like a forgotten logistics warehouse, invisible to the casual observer but impenetrable to thieves. Balthazar parked 2 blocks away and walked the remaining distance. He approached the side entrance, a heavy steel door monitored by a single, high-definition camera. He didn't wear a mask. He needed to look like he belonged. He swiped the magnetic fob across the reader. A sharp, electronic beat pierced the damp air, followed by the heavy clunk of the deadbolt disengaging. Balthazar pushed the door open, stepping into a sterile, climate-controlled corridor that smelled faintly of ozone and dust. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low hum of industrial dehumidifiers. He navigated the labyrinth of identical steel doors, the brass key cold against his palm, until he reached Unit 404. He inserted the key. It turned with a smooth, oiled click. The door swung outward, revealing a space the size of a small apartment. It was not a storage unit. It was a museum hidden in the dark. Racks of custom-built, climate-controlled crates lined the walls. Balthazar flicked on a heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. He walked down the center aisle, reading the digital inventory tags attached to the crates. These were not the works of unknown artists or the detritus of estate sales. These were the ghosts of the Metropolitan Gallery. He found the crate labeled with the accession number of the post-impressionist landscape Bryony had recently acquired. He unlatched the heavy wooden lid and carefully pulled back the layers of archival Tyvek and acid-free tissue paper. There, resting in the absolute darkness, was the original masterpiece. The forgery hanging in the museum was brilliant, but the painting before him possessed a depth, a luminous quality of light and color that Rowena's skilled hands could never replicate. Balthazar stared at the canvas, the physical proof of his wife's staggering betrayal staring back at him. He didn't just find one painting. He spent the next 2 hours opening crate after crate. The volume of stolen art was staggering. Bryony and Julian had systematically pillaged the museum's archives for years, replacing authentic pieces with Rowena's fakes, hoarding the originals in this concrete tomb to be sold on the black market or used as collateral for their escape. Balthazar pulled a compact, high-resolution camera from his jacket. He methodically photographed every canvas, every crate label, every inventory tag. He documented the serial numbers on the climate control units and the proprietary security seals Julian used. When he finished, he had compiled an insurmountable mountain of irrefutable evidence. He repacked the crates with the same agonizing precision with which he dissected financial ledgers. He locked Unit 404, the brass key returning to his pocket, heavy with the weight of absolute victory. Bryony and Julian were currently toasting to their success in Venice, entirely unaware that Balthazar had just seized the very foundation of their empire. The trap was fully loaded. Now he only needed to spring it. The silence of the Marais apartment had transformed from a space of luxurious comfort into a high-tech command center. Balthazar sat before his glowing monitors, the city of Paris sleeping deeply beneath the pale moonlight outside his window. Bryony and Julian were scheduled to return from Venice in exactly 14 hours. Balthazar had precisely that long to bleed them dry. The physical evidence from the storage unit was secure, a meticulously compiled digital dossier containing hundreds of high-resolution photographs, inventory logs, and the geolocation of the vault. But Balthazar knew that physical art, no matter how valuable, was notoriously difficult to liquidate quickly when the authorities were closing in. The real power, the true lifeblood of Julian and Bryony's escape plan, was the liquid capital sitting in offshore accounts. He cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and initiated the digital skeleton key he had used to uncover Julian's initial framing attempt. Balthazar didn't just log into Julian's accounts. He became a ghost within the banking infrastructure of Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. He navigated the labyrinth of shell corporations with the lethal grace of a predator who had spent his entire career studying the hunting patterns of white-collar criminals. First, he targeted the blind trust holding the $25 million from the forged post-impressionist landscape. Julian had layered the account with complex, biometric security protocols, but Balthazar bypassed them by rerouting the authentication requests through a cloned proxy server he had set up using Bryony's compromised laptop. To the bank's automated systems, the login request appeared to originate from Bryony herself, perfectly aligning with her forged role as the syndicate's financial architect. With a few keystrokes, the account balance populated the screen, $12,450,000 in total accumulated illicit funds. Balthazar didn't hesitate. He initiated a cascading series of wire transfers. He didn't steal the money for himself. That would make him a criminal. Instead, he employed a technique known as iceboxing. He transferred the entire sum into a highly secure, escrow-style holding account controlled by a decentralized, anonymous legal entity he had established in a jurisdiction notoriously hostile to rapid extradition or asset seizure. The funds vanished from Julian's control, replaced by a string of encrypted zeros. He moved systematically through Julian's entire financial portfolio. He froze the operational accounts for Julian's boutique gallery, flagged the credit lines connected to his holding companies for suspicious international activity, and severed the auto-pay functions for the climate-controlled storage unit near Charles de Gaulle. By 4 a.m., Julian St. James, the charismatic art dealer who believed he was masterminding the heist of the century, was entirely bankrupt. He didn't have the liquidity to buy a croissant in the 8th arrondissement, let alone charter a private jet to South America. But Balthazar was not finished. He returned to the forged documents Bryony had drafted to frame him. He didn't delete them. Instead, he embedded microscopic digital watermarks into the metadata of every file, cryptographic signatures that irrefutably linked the creation of the documents to Bryony's personal devices, her specific IP address, and Julian's compromised server. When the authorities eventually analyzed the forgery ring, the very evidence Bryony had intended to use as a weapon against her husband would become the unshakable foundation of her own prosecution. Balthazar leaned back in his leather chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his dark, entirely emotionless eyes. The financial assassination was complete. He had severed the veins of their empire without shedding a single drop of blood. He picked up his crystal tumbler, pouring a measure of scotch. He raised the glass to the glowing screens, a silent toast to the meticulous, devastating power of mathematics. Art is about authenticity, Bryony, Balthazar whispered to the empty room, his voice a chilling echo in the silence. Pity Your Love was the cheapest forgery of all. The gray light of a Parisian dawn began to bleed through the tall windows of the study, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Balthazar had not slept, but he felt a strange, crystalline clarity. The exhaustion that usually accompanied 48 hours of intense focus was entirely absent, replaced by the cold hum of adrenaline that predated an execution. He sat before his workstation, the digital dossier open on his primary monitor. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting and investigative journalism. The file, named simply Project Provenance, contained every piece of evidence he had meticulously gathered over the past week. There were high-resolution photographs of the original masterpieces hidden in the climate-controlled storage unit near Charles de Gaulle, cross-referenced with the public accession numbers from the Metropolitan Gallery. There were digital copies of the forged invoices Julian had drafted, complete with the embedded metadata proving Bryony had authored them from her personal laptop in their Marais apartment. But the most devastating component of the dossier was the financial ledger. Balthazar had mapped the exact flow of the $8.25 million from the fraudulent sale of the post-impressionist forgery, tracing it through Julian's now-frozen offshore shell companies in Cyprus. It was a complete, irrefutable map of a multi-million-euro criminal syndicate operating at the highest levels of the French art world. Balthazar opened a highly secure, encrypted email client routed through a series of anonymous proxy servers located in jurisdictions that did not comply with international data requests. He was not going to simply call the police. He was going to orchestrate a coordinated strike. He addressed the first email to the Office Central de Lutte contre le Trafic de Biens Culturels, OCBC, the specialized French police unit dedicated to art, theft, and forgery. The second recipient was the lead investigator at Interpol's Works of Art unit in Lyon. The final recipient was the board of directors at the Metropolitan Gallery, ensuring Bryony's professional ruin would be simultaneous with her criminal prosecution. Once he pressed enter, the life he had built, the high society dinners, the curated apartment, the illusion of a perfect marriage, would be annihilated in a spectacular public inferno. He thought of Bryony, currently boarding a first-class flight in Venice, likely sipping champagne and laughing with Julian, entirely secure in the belief that she was outsmarting her brilliant, oblivious husband. He thought of the way she had smiled at him the morning after bringing her lover into their home, the flawless execution of her deceit. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute resolve. He pressed the enter key. The progress bar on the screen filled rapidly, a silent countdown to their destruction. Message sent. Balthazar closed the encrypted client and initiated a comprehensive wipe of his workstation. He deployed military-grade data destruction software, permanently erasing his digital footprints from the last 48 hours. To anyone analyzing his computers, he had spent the weekend reviewing mundane corporate tax files. He stood up from the leather chair, his joints stiff from hours of immobility. He walked out of the study and into the pristine, silent apartment. He checked his watch. Bryony's flight would land at Charles de Gaulle in exactly 3 hours. The authorities would need time to verify the dossier, secure a warrant for the storage unit, and mobilize a strike team. Balthazar calculated he had roughly 6 hours before the Marais apartment became ground zero. He walked into the master bedroom, the air still faintly smelling of Bryony's Chanel perfume. He did not pack a bag. He did not intend to run. He intended to be exactly where he was supposed to be when the world ended, waiting for his wife to come home. The Marais apartment was as silent as a tomb when the heavy oak door finally chimed. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Balthazar sat precisely where he had been when this nightmare began, in the high-backed leather chair of his study, the room shrouded in the dim, slate-gray light of a Parisian rainstorm. He did not move as the door swung open. "I told you, he's in meetings until 6. Bryony's voice floated down the hallway, laced with the familiar, breathless laughter Balthazar had heard days ago. "We have the place entirely to ourselves, Julian." "You are a terrible, wonderful woman," Julian replied, the sound of a heavy suitcase being dropped onto the parquet floor echoing through the apartment. Balthazar remained perfectly still, a phantom in his own home. He listened to the rustle of their coats being discarded, the soft click of Bryony's heels approaching the master bedroom. They were entirely predictable, intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. He waited until they were halfway down the hall, directly in his line of sight from the cracked study door. "Actually, Bryony," Balthazar said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a scalpel. It possessed a terrifying, absolute calm. "My meetings were canceled." The breathless laughter died instantly. Bryony froze in her tracks, her hand resting intimately on the small of Julian's back. She turned slowly, her hazel eyes wide, the color draining from her flawless face. Julian's charming, predatory smile vanished, replaced by a rigid mask of sudden, cold calculation. Balthazar stood up from the leather chair and stepped out of the shadows of the study. He wore a dark, tailored suit, looking every inch the formidable forensic accountant he was. He did not scream. He did not lunge at them. He simply walked toward the antique console table in the foyer, his footsteps loud and measured against the wood. "Balthazar," Bryony stammered, taking a small step back. I thought you were at the firm." "I was occupied with a rather complex audit," Balthazar replied, his gaze locking onto Julian. "It appears there have been significant discrepancies in a series of offshore holding companies. Cyprus, specifically." Julian's jaw tightened. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Balthazar." "I am talking about $8.25 million, Julian," Balthazar stated, his voice dropping to a freezing register. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a printed summary of the frozen accounts. He dropped it onto the console table. It fluttered down, landing perfectly beside the vase they had almost shattered days ago. Or, rather, the absolute lack of it. "Your blind trusts are entirely empty." Julian stared at the paper, the muscles in his neck cording. The realization hit him with physical force. He lunged forward, snatching the paper, his eyes frantically scanning the strings of zeros. "What did you do?" Julian hissed, the charm entirely stripped away, revealing the desperate grifter underneath. "I froze your assets," Balthazar said calmly, "and I rerouted the funds to an escrow account you will never access. You are financially paralyzed." Bryony stared at her husband, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Balthazar, please, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly, Bryony," Balthazar interrupted, finally looking at his wife. The sheer hatred in his eyes silenced her completely. "I understand that you authenticated a forgery for a fraction of its value. I understand you used my name, my IP address, and my career to draft forged invoices to frame me for your syndicate." He took another step toward them, the air in the hallway turning to ice. "I know about Rowena. I know about the titanium dioxide." And Balthazar reached into his pocket again, pulling out the heavy brass key and dropping it onto the table with a loud, metallic clack. "I know exactly what is sitting in Unit 404 near Charles de Gaulle." The sight of the key shattered Bryony entirely. She staggered backward, a ragged sob tearing from her throat, her hands flying to her mouth. Julian stared at the key, his face ashen, realizing he was not just broke, he was trapped. Balthazar looked at the two architects of his ruin, feeling absolutely nothing but the cold satisfaction of a completed equation. "The audit is finished," he whispered. The silence in the hallway was no longer the expensive, insulated quiet of a luxury Parisian apartment. It was the suffocating vacuum of a collapsed mine. Julian stared at the brass key resting on the console table, his mind visibly racing through a labyrinth of non-existent exits. "You have no proof," Julian spat, though the rapid tremor in his voice betrayed him entirely. "A key proves nothing. An empty bank account proves nothing." "The OCBC will disagree," Balthazar replied smoothly, casually checking the time on his vintage Patek Philippe watch. "I sent them a heavily encrypted dossier 3 hours ago. It contains the multispectral scans of the forgery at the gallery, cross-referenced with the genuine articles sitting in Unit 404. It also includes the digital metadata of the fraudulent invoices you intended to use to frame me, traced directly to my wife's IP address." Bryony crumpled. Her knees gave out, and she sank onto the antique Persian rug, the pristine silk of her designer blouse wrinkling. The flawless curator, the untouchable queen of the Parisian elite art scene, was instantly reduced to a trembling, hyperventilating shell. "Balthazar, please," she begged, tears streaking her perfectly applied makeup. She reached out, her trembling fingers grasping at the hem of his trousers. "I was manipulated. He forced me. He said he would ruin the museum's reputation if I didn't authenticate the piece. I love you. You have to believe me." Balthazar looked down at her. For a fraction of a second, the ghost of the man who had loved her surfaced, a sharp, piercing ache radiating from the center of his chest. But the forensic accountant ruthlessly crushed it beneath a glacier of logic. "You drafted the invoices to send me to federal prison from our own bed, Bryony," Balthazar stated, his voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "You used my social security number. You calculated my ruin with the exact same precision you used to curate your exhibitions. Do not insult my intelligence by playing the victim now." Julian, realizing the absolute finality of the situation, lunged. It was not a calculated strike, but the chaotic, unthinking thrashing of a cornered animal. He grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the console table, raising it like a club. Balthazar did not flinch. He simply shifted his weight, allowing the heavy oak door behind Julian to serve as a psychological barrier. He knew men like Julian. They were parasites, not killers. Before Julian could swing, a sound pierced the heavy glass windows of the apartment. It was faint at first, a distant wail echoing through the wet streets of Le Marais. Then it multiplied. The unmistakable, dissonant chorus of French police sirens rapidly approaching their block. Julian froze, the lamp trembling in his raised hand. The flashing blue lights began to strobe against the rain-slicked windows, casting erratic, skeletal shadows across the herringbone floor. "You killed us both," Julian whispered, the heavy brass lamp slipping from his grip and crashing onto the floorboards with a dull thud. "I merely audited the ledger," Balthazar corrected softly. "You bankrupted yourselves. Heavy, synchronized footsteps thundered up the stairwell, bypassing the private elevator. The sound of a heavy fist colliding with the reinforced oak of the front door echoed like a cannon shot. Police Nationale of Reslauport. Balthazar stepped gracefully to the side, unlocking the deadbolt and pulling the door open just as the officers prepared to strike again. A dozen armed officers in tactical gear flooded the elegant foyer, their weapons drawn, followed immediately by plainclothes detectives from the OCBC. Julian St. James. Bryony. The lead detective paused, glancing at Balthazar, who gave a slow, affirming nod. You are both under arrest for grand larceny, criminal conspiracy, and the forgery of national cultural heritage. Bryony screamed as the cold steel handcuffs snapped around her delicate wrists. She looked back at Balthazar as she was hauled to her feet, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of hatred and absolute despair. Julian offered no resistance. He was roughly shoved against the wall to be searched, his charismatic facade entirely obliterated. Balthazar stood by the vintage credenza, his face a mask of immaculate stone, watching the authorities drag the wreckage of his marriage out into the unforgiving Parisian rain. The heavy oak door of the apartment finally closed, shutting out the chaos of the police raid and the strobe of blue lights against the wet Parisian asphalt. Balthazar stood alone in the grand foyer. The air still carried the faint, chaotic energy of the arrest, mingling with the lingering scent of Bryony's Chanel perfume and the metallic tang of fear. The silence that reclaimed the space was no longer the heavy, expensive quiet of a curated life. It was the deafening, hollow roar of an empty tomb. Balthazar walked slowly through the rooms he had shared with his wife for 7 years. He passed the antique console table, now scarred where Julian had dropped the heavy brass lamp. He moved into the dining room, the crystal baccarat chandelier casting long, fractured shadows across the mahogany table where they had hosted their final, suffocating dinner party. Everything was exactly as it had been, perfectly arranged, flawlessly aesthetic, and entirely devoid of meaning. He entered the master bedroom. The bed was impeccably made. He opened Bryony's closet. Her silk dresses and designer coats hung in precise, color-coordinated rows, ghosts of a woman who had never truly existed. He closed the doors with a soft click, the sound echoing in his chest. He had won. The forensic accountant had executed the perfect audit. The offshore accounts were frozen in an untraceable void. The stolen masterpieces were secured by Interpol, and the architects of his ruin were currently sitting in separate, concrete interrogation rooms at the headquarters of the Police Nationale. Julian St. James would spend the next 2 decades in federal prison for grand larceny, and Bryony, his brilliant, beautiful, treacherous wife, would join him for orchestrating the forgery of national cultural heritage and the attempted framing of an innocent man. Balthazar's name was clear. His assets were secure. His professional reputation remained untouchable. Yet, as he walked back into his dimly lit study, the victory tasted like ash and copper. He sat in his high-backed leather chair, staring at the blank, darkened monitors that had served as his weapons for the past week. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the meticulous planning, the hacking, and the confrontation had completely evaporated, leaving behind an absolute, freezing exhaustion. He had spent his life dissecting the invisible flow of hidden assets, dismantling lies built by desperate people. He had applied the exact same cold, mathematical precision to his own marriage, and he had successfully destroyed the deception. But in burning the forgery to the ground, he realized with a profound, aching clarity that there was no authentic original underneath to save. The woman he loved had been a masterclass in fabrication. Every whispered word, every shared glass of wine, every touch in the dark had been a calculated stroke on a fake canvas. He had not lost his wife. He had simply discovered she was never his to begin with. Balthazar slowly raised his left hand. The gold band on his ring finger caught the faint, amber light from the street lamp outside the window. It felt suddenly heavy, like a shackle forged from a lie. He slid the ring over his knuckle. It slipped off easily, leaving a pale, indented band of skin in its wake. He placed the heavy gold circle precisely in the center of his mahogany desk, next to a small, framed photograph of Bryony smiling at him on their wedding day in Provence. He did not pack a bag. He did not turn off the lights. He simply picked up his overcoat and walked out of the study, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous, immaculate apartment. He reached the front door, pausing for only a fraction of a second to look back at the perfect, hollow life he had curated. The bitter wind of the Parisian night swept through the hallway as he opened the door, chilling him to the bone. Balthazar stepped out into the shadows, a ghost leaving a museum of broken things. He pulled his collar up against the rain, walking away from the ruins of his marriage with the slow, measured pace of a man who had finally settled his accounts. Art is about authenticity, Bryony, Balthazar whispered into the cold, empty street, the words swallowed by the relentless downpour. Pity Your Love was the cheapest forgery of all.